Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LCK Summer Split Playoffs Round Number 1 overview and analysis video. We have done it. We finally made it to the LCK playoffs. It's the final playoffs to start of all of the major regions. We've been deep in the coverage of all of the other ones, and so it's finally time that the LCK ends up catching up. They, of course, have a little bit of a smaller playoff run, but that means these games are even more important. There is no double elimination in round number 1, and so if you lose today, you are out. Of course, every single team that made the playoffs does end up making the regional qualifiers just based off of how championship points end up working, but still very important to be able to get into that top 4 to get as close as you possibly can to getting to Worlds. You want to get as many championship points as possible. Getting a top 3 or a top 4 seed is a lot better than getting the number 5 or 6 seed here domestically. So a lot on the line in these games. I'm excited. Please check out the video up in the iCard though. That is my preview, my primer for the playoffs here. Not only do we go over every single one of my regular season awards, that's MVP, that's Rookie of the Split, that's all 3 of my All-Pro teams, but of course we also preview everything that has to do with the playoffs, every single team, all of the matchups here in round 1, as well as giving a full mock bracket. If you are interested in my thoughts, my analysis, my opinions on what I expect to happen in these series and the series moving forward, that video is the one to check out. We put a lot of time and effort into those primer videos, and so give it a watch if you are interested. But of course, today is just going to be spent talking about the series, so without further ado, let's get into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in both of the round 1 series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, at the end of the episode, we will be talking a bit about the round 2 matchups. They have been announced. We have gotten our selection, I believe, at this point, and it's not really a huge surprise, as we'll talk about at the end of the video, but of course, most of today will be spent talking about round number 1. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. Who's kicking off the playoffs? Well, it's one of the more lopsided series, at least on paper, going into this tournament. It's the number 3 seeded Dplus KIA taking on the number 6 seeded BNK FearX. And the reason I say this is one of the more lopsided matchups is because it really does feel like a pseudo top 5 right now in the LCK, where all 5 of the top 5 teams feel competitive, at least at some level. KT Rolster obviously has had their own set of struggles. We'll talk about that a bit more later, but that number 6 spot was open for the entirety of the year. There was nobody that was really claiming that and being consistent and really feeling like a dominant playoff team. FearX is the team that ends up grabbing it. They definitely were, in my opinion, the 6th best team coming out of the regular season, but they were still below 500, not only just in terms of game score, but in terms of series score as well, coming in at 8 and 10, and there are real question marks to this team. Henna and Duro have not exactly been as strong down the stretch. I still really believe in Duro in particular in the support position. It really feels like he has elevated this team quite a bit ever since coming in to replace Execute, who just was not particularly good for this team. But Henna, not a player I particularly believe in at a playoff level. He's somebody who's just kind of been his entire career on Bro. He's probably having the best split of his career, but a lot of that I attribute to really good support play, as I've talked about for a lot of this year. And even if you do like the top side of this map, which I do, I think Clear has been really intriguing. I think people hate on this comment, but he's essentially been what Bertle was for Sandbox last year in the spring split, where you get a lot of these really good games and you get a couple of the bad games kind of sprinkled in. Sometimes the bad games mentally outweigh the good ones in terms of what you remember, but the good games are absolutely there. I think Raptor has been very feast or famine, basically exactly what Willer was giving this team. You know, the games that he wins are great, but he loses a ton of games. Almost every single game that FearX plays is centered around this jungle matchup and whether or not he can skirmish early. And then Closer, who's actually been decently consistent for FearX across this split. It's kind of funny. He's taken more of a backseat role, and I think that's really helped him individually as a player. But, like, you have a lot of feast or famine-ness in this FearX team. The problem is, I don't know if you have the talent to feast against a team like Dplus KIA, who is genuinely one of the best teams in the LCK. You know, we've kind of been waiting for the other shoe to drop because they've gotten so much better over the course of the year. Spring Split was up and down for sure, but they did end up making top 4, even if they were a little bit questionable in the regular season. They come into summer, and honestly, everything just clicks a little bit better. Lucid, who is a bit of a problem for them, at the very least in the regular season, in spring ends up being really good for this team. You have players like Showmaker and Aiming that are, you know, really stepping up. Showmaker, another very volatile carry. He can have really great games, really bad ones, but most of the time it's just because they rely so much on his pressure in the mid to late game that when it doesn't work out, he genuinely just looks worse because of the situation around him. But Aiming, I mean, sets like a ton of records in terms of the statistics and the numbers he was able to put up in the regular season, even if not all of that that shows up on tape. The biggest question mark for me is going to be the support position. Obviously, Moham came in the middle of the split, towards the back half of the split to replace Kellen. This is definitely a change. I'm not even going to say this is an upgrade or a downgrade because it's just, they're two very different players. Moham is your typical, like, let's roam, let's try to engage, you know, aggressive support that wants to play for skirmishes, wants to play for team fights, loves playing things like Rel and Alistair and, you know, being that big engage threat. And Kellen can absolutely do that, but Kellen is much more known as a macro player, as somebody who is known for his shot calling, who's known for great vision control, and is known for kind of guiding the team through the mid game. And so, two very different players. Moham going to be a lot more focused on a lot of action, you know, across the game, I would say, rather than slowing the pace down. And, you know, that can be a positive for DK. So far, it's actually been pretty good. I've always liked Moham individually as a player, but I really like Kellen as well. I don't know if this is an upgrade, if purely just because I don't know if DK is one of those teams that can go up against some of the best in the entire world without a player like Kellen, like actively trying to point them in a direction. But Moham has been good so far, so that's definitely something to monitor. Kingan's been solid on the top side. DK are definitely favorites in this series. That I want to make abundantly clear. FearX are going to be underdogs against anybody that they're running into, but DK has actually been really good over the course of this split, and I think you could make a strong argument they're better in basically every single role, as I did in my preview series a couple of days ago. So that's definitely the expectation going into it, but we've seen upsets in this league in the past. Are we going to see another one here in round number 1? The only way to find out is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was Dplus KIA. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this was a really good look for them overall. Very funny draft. They end up drafting Nasus mid, Smolder in the bot lane. Like, yeah, we want to scale. We want to go into the late game. I think they made that abundantly clear, but even with all that, even with the fact that they drafted essentially exclusively for the 5v5 team fight in the back half of the game, they actually still did a really good job at establishing pressure early on, and that makes it impossible for FearX to win this game. The Nasus actually got a ton of stacks early on. He was able to completely outduel Closer, who was okay in this game. He was much better in the team fight stage of the game, but there was only so much he could do. The laning phase really wasn't all that great for the Azir. Like, he was up in gold, but Nasus kind of got to do everything he wanted to do, and eventually did get to that break point in the mid to late game where he could just stand there in team fights and never die and do a billion damage, and that's kind of the disaster zone if you're FearX in this comp. But you add a Smolder on top of that, you add a Rumble on top of that, you have Moham on the Rel, his signature champion. It's just a very, very strange way to play the game from FearX, in my opinion. I think you gave DK way too many resources and way too many opportunities, and yeah, they took advantage of it. They looked pretty good in taking advantage of it. Player of the game was honestly kind of difficult for me because I do think this was much more of a well-rounded effort, but I'm going to give it to Showmaker in the mid lane. I know that feels a bit out of character for me because he was the one that was just kind of set up, but once the Nasus was able to kind of get rolling, like, this game was over. There was no way to just quote-unquote outplay it. Like, Moham, obviously, you want to give a lot of credit for the Rel. I don't think he had any, like, ridiculous engages this game that, like, completely broke FearX. I thought he was always in the right place at the right time, and his setups were very good, but generally, I think getting that Nasus ahead and getting him online and Showmaker surviving that early game is what doomed FearX throughout the rest of this. Aiming was another player that I really considered because he was able to take over some of these late fights on the Smolder. The moment that he started hitting those stacks, all of a sudden the game became genuinely, I mean, it was already unwinnable, right, when Nasus was hitting stacks, but when both of them were online, like, there's just absolutely no way to be able to front to back against them, and DK is way too organized as a team to really give them these free advantages, and so you end up in these situations where, like, Nasus is just running down your carries and killing them on the spot, and Smolder can burst through any tank in the entire game because he has that kind of damage, and there's genuinely just no way to play through it. Even if you were able to get on them, you have an Ivern on this team to be able to help that. Like, it's just a disaster, right? Like, there's nothing to do for FearX, and you got to give a lot of credit to DK for that. That's obviously the idea behind this draft and behind this comp, and I do think they executed on it well. I think Kingan got caught out a little bit more than maybe I would have liked. He was the one player where I was like, the Rumble ultimates were good, and they were well-timed, and it felt like he was on the same page as the rest of the team, but maybe some of the individual mechanics weren't exactly there, but that's fine. I mean, if this is the worst it gets for Kingan, I think they're going to be just fine in this series overall, but again, pretty good game number 1, even if a bit stock standard, a bit of a risky draft, but it ends up working out because you're better And then for FearX, this is a very concerning loss because this should be a winnable game. I mean, the draft is so greedy from DK, as we've stated. Nasus plus Smolder, like, there is no way for this team to do anything in the early game, and you were still down like 2k gold going into the mid game. It's just a disaster. You can't really allow this to happen, and it's on quite a few members. Dud of the game for me, though, is pretty easily going to go to Raptor. I don't really see how you don't blame this game at least a little bit on Raptor, because his pathing was just so slow. You're playing Xin Zhao, one of your most played champions, the champion I personally most associate with you individually as a player, and you're playing him so scared and so passive, and I get it. It's very difficult for Xin Zhao to, like, quote-unquote punish Ivern. It's not one of those matchups where you can just walk in and fight him and just, like, do whatever he wants, especially because for some reason, like, things like Nasus and Smolder weren't exactly losing lane prio throughout a lot of this game, but you have to be able to try and push the tempo somewhere. You have to be looking for these ganks. You have to be looking for these plays, because the longer this game goes, the more unwinnable it ends up being for this team, and it felt like Raptor just didn't have that sense of urgency, and when he did go in and fight, he was entirely useless. He was getting completely obliterated by the Nasus in the mid to late game. There was just nothing that this champion could do. I also think the Seraphine just wasn't particularly valuable in this game. Again, I understand the idea behind Seraphine. We're seeing it pick up a lot of traction, not only here in the LCK, but in other regions in the support position as well, but I just don't know if I agree with it. Like, I get this idea that it's supposed to win lane. It's supposed to be a bit of a, you know, a Sona light where it kind of does a bit of everything, or I guess a Sona plus if you really want to call it that, but it just doesn't end up actually functioning like that in the current meta. You are much better off just drafting like a Braum and just attempting to enable the Ashe. Now, Braum was banned in this game, but you know what I mean. Like, something of that nature. If you want to draft Ashe and if you want to try to get the most out of her, then draft something that can just allow her to play more aggressive rather than drafting something that can play aggressive alongside the Ashe. And if you do want to go for that more, you know, strong 2v2, quote unquote, I think something like Ezreal Karma could be on the table. Obviously, things like Kalista Renata are on the table. I'm just not as sold on Seraphine individually as a champion. I think that it's definitely not really proved my point correct. I think Duro was kind of useless in this game. Henna, Closer, Clear, I mean, they were along for the ride. Clear was not particularly good on the Ornn, but wasn't like a massive problem. I thought Closer was probably the best player on FearX, and even then he wasn't very good in lane. He just was kind of okay in some of these team fights. Like, it's not the most encouraging game of all time for FearX, but hopefully they can bounce back. They're only down 0-1. If you win game 2, tie up the series, you know, a lot of things do end up changing, but if DK can get that 2-0 series lead, like is kind of expected in terms of how this series goes, then it's a pretty bad spot to be in if you're FearX, but you're kind of playing with house money at this point in terms of expectations. So, are they going to be able to tie up the series at 1 apiece, or is DK going to take a dominant 2-0 series lead? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Dplus KIA. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and they have completely dominated the first half of this series. I say that this game was close, like they were never completely, like fully in the driver's seat, like alone. I guess they were definitely the ones leading the game, and it never really felt like they were going to lose. They were the ones making all the big plays, and they were definitely the ones controlling the tempo of the game, but FearX was still alive, at least in terms of gold. They were relatively even for the entire game, which I think is a positive. You still get these ridiculously greedy drafts coming out of DK where you get Maokai plus Corki plus Smolder, and you don't really have any tools to try to play the early game out. I think FearX did a better job, at the very least, in this game of attempting to do things, attempting to try to stop DK from just getting the game out of control, but they're just not good enough. Like, I really hate to say it, it feels like there is just such a big talent gap between these two that even when FearX is attempting to do the right thing, it never really actually translates into that, and you just get these situations where they're just outclassed, and it's unfortunate how that ends up working out, but it is what it is. Player of the game for me here in game number 2 is going to go to Kingin on the top side. You know, the Cassante looked amazing in this game. He gets that solo kill on the top side against Clear, and just generally a lot of the breaking that he did in the team fights was so massive for DK to be able to open up a lot more opportunities for the Smolder and the Corki to just start to take over. I think Cassante is just one of those champions where if you can pilot it at a super high level, there's really not a lot people can do to kind of shut that down or stop it, so it's really good to see Kingin have a good game. I kind of got some some disagreements in the comments of my primer video. Really, the most consistent one was that Kingin probably should have been second team All-Pro instead of third team, that Doran might be moved down to third team. I can understand that. I think Kingan's been really good and really important for DK. I do think people really underestimate Doran. I continue to be on the train for that. I think he's a lot better and a lot more important to HLE than people give him credit for, but I'm certainly not trying to say that in a disrespectful way to Kingan. Like, I understand how important and how good he was. Clear very narrowly took his spot, but that is only because, like, if I'm leaving someone like Clear, who had a pretty good regular season, off for Kingan, that should show you that I do value what Kingan brought to DK over the course of this year. I do want to, of course, shout out Aiming. This guy just does so much damage in these late game team fights. He is so predictable in his role, and yet he is basically unstoppable in it, where he really doesn't have to do all that much in the early game. He's asked essentially to just be, you know, this third or fourth piece in the early game to try to create plays, but the moment that we get to these front-to-back team fights, he instantly becomes one of the scariest players in the entire league. It's very funny how, again, I will continue to say what I've said about Aiming for a while. He is like the quintessential AD carry. Like, he doesn't really do a lot of the things, he doesn't go above and beyond in terms of the position, but in terms of like the core AD carry things, like the things that are essential to play the role at a professional level, he's the best at those in the LCK. And so it's just a very funny build for a player where he's not like particularly versatile, but he's so good at the thing he's good at that it ends up being very valuable anyways. And that's why he's able to put out a ridiculous amount of stats and damage, and, you know, you break the kill record in the LCK, all of those things, because he is so good in these late fights where you can attribute a lot of that to. Showmaker continues to be good. Moham continues to look really good. I get that he's just given Rel over and over again, and at some point, I feel like some team is going to have to try to take him off of this champion, but at least for now, if he's going to be given it, then play it. You know, I'm not going to complain about that too much, but DK looking very good here. And then for FearX on the other side, they just don't feel like they're on the same level, even when they're in okay positions, even when they're up like 1 to 2k gold basically the entire game. They're really not able to actually do anything with it. Even when they were winning in gold, it never really felt like they were the ones deciding when plays happened. They were not controlling the tempo. They were just kind of hoping and praying that DK would eventually fall over and that they could win a team fight, and that just was not going to happen against Corki, Smolder, Maokai. I don't really like the game plan here. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Clear on the top side. Gets solo killed by Kingan in the top lane. I know that there are some plays where the Renekton attempted to take over, but I think generally speaking in the late game team fights, he was essentially irrelevant. And typically speaking, you're not going to worry about that too much when it comes to a Renekton, but because this team is so passive in the early game, because they're not pushing that 1 to 2k gold lead nearly as much as they should, then Clear does need to be more relevant when they do get to these front-to-back fights, because he really is the only disruptor on this team. You can hope and pray that that ends up being Lilia, or that an Ashe arrow somehow lands on the backline, but it's just so rare that that ends up happening. You need the Renekton to go and try and make Smolder and Corki's life a lot more difficult, and when Clear's just not really doing anything in these fights, that becomes a lot more of a problem. I do also want to shout out Henna. Henna had some good moments, but man, he had some bad moments. Like that one fight down in the bot lane where he picks up a double kill, that was pretty good. Like, I thought he played that really well. Everything else in that game, not so good. And so again, Henna just not looking very good mechanically in this series, and that's a bit of a problem for the team. Duro, I do not think has been able to hold a candle to Moham in terms of the engage potential, but how much of that is the rest of the team? Raptor getting completely out jungled and just being way too passive here in his first playoff series. You know, FearX just don't look like they're on the same page as, you know, DK in terms of tiers, and it is what it is. You're not expecting this team to be able to compete at the highest level, but, you know, I would have hoped that they would have put up a slightly better fight than what they're doing right now. But for DK, you're happy to be up 2-0, and you probably want to close this out in a 3-0 sweep. I think that would give you the confidence that you want going into round number 2, but if FearX can win a game, I think they'd probably consider that an accomplishment. So which one's going to happen? Well, the winner of game number 3 was FearX. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to stay alive in this series by picking up the win, and obviously, they really needed this. If they lost this, they would have been eliminated from the playoffs in a clean sweep. Certainly not the ideal set of circumstances, but as such major underdogs coming into this series, to win a game really at all, I think is going to be considered kind of a small accomplishment for them, but this was wild. This was a 50-minute banger, a back-and-forth game where nobody was really able to establish a ton of pressure on their own. In fact, the game ends with Dplus KIA getting Elder Dragon, trading that after getting their Baron stolen out from under them, going to end the game by base rushing. And then instead of just winning the fight because they have Elder and they're very strong, losing the fight and losing the game, just getting completely aced in their pursuit of trying to take down the Nexus and having it end there. FearX had a pretty decent lead in the early game, but DK, as they are one to do, is able to fight back, stay relatively close because they are just straight up better in a lot of these fights. So even when they're fighting from a disadvantage, it's usually in their favor, and they were able to tie up, even up this game. And again, they probably should have been able to finish this in a clean sweep, but they just weren't able to do that. Credit to FearX for being being able to hang on and for looking good down the stretch of this game. You can talk about two players, one controlling the early game and one controlling the late game for FearX in my opinion, but I'm going to give it to the late game player. My player of the game is going to go to Clear in the top lane on the Camille. This pick can sometimes look entirely useless. We've seen this champion just not be all that relevant in actually quite a few different series over the course of this year. It just feels like one of those flex picks, and not in like a flex between roles, but like I'm trying to flex, like an ego pick a bit in the top lane, and oftentimes that just doesn't work. But Clear obviously feels very comfortable in the champion, pulling it out in an elimination game here, and he popped off in some of these late fights. There really was no answer for the Camille. Really the only times that they were able to get DK, that is, that they were able to get pressure on the map is when they were able to get picks without the Camille either there or without the Camille engaging first. If Clear was, you know, kind of paying attention and actually doing the things he was supposed to do, he just completely took over a lot of these late 5v5s because they didn't really have a clear answer to get him off of their main carries. So credit to Clear. I thought he played really well on the Camille, but if you want to go for the early game route for player of the game, that should be Henna. On the Ziggs, he was just taking tower after tower after tower, just moving him around the map, constantly using his pressure to kind of just keep that gold lead as high as possible. Raptor, I thought, did a really good job of making sure that not only Henna was in a good position, but that the team around him was actually doing productive things, and it wasn't just waiting on the Ziggs to take towers in bot and in top. And, you know, that push on the top side where they're able to get 2 towers in one push without Rift Herald, it's just really, really good stuff from FearX. Their macro this game was significantly better than it was in the first two, and I think that that's a pretty important way to play this series out. I think Duro was awesome on the Alistair, some fantastic engages down the stretch. I'm still a bit concerned about Raptor and his team fighting because his team fighting is really just not very good. Like, Willer struggled in that phase as well. That was always Willer's big weakness as a player, is that he's a very good early game jungler, very aggressive, and, you know, can control tempo well in the mid game, but is not a good 5v5 player. And I think Raptor is very similar in that regard, just not a very comfortable 5v5 player. Think someone like Weiwei over in the LPL, where you get these moments where he's just out of position and doesn't necessarily have the big impact that you're kind of looking for when you pick something like Maokai, but it was generally fine. And again, overall, when you have the Camille and the Ziggs and the Corki doing so much damage in the back half of the game, you just need to win one fight. You need this game to go long enough, and as it did, you just have to win that one fight at the end, and that's what they did, even if they probably weren't the better team throughout a majority of this game. But for DK, it definitely feels a little unfortunate that you weren't able to win this because you were in such a good spot. You were able to get Elder. You know, getting Baron stolen out from under you is not ideal, but it gave you the Elder buff. You should have been able to end the game, and you just weren't able to win the fight. Really good engage by Duro ends up setting that up, but a lot of good to take away from this for DK as well. I thought Moham had some phenomenal engages on Rel, and he has really been unstoppable on that champion. He just has such an eye for trying to find backline in these fights. I think it reminds me a lot of Crisp, who we've talked about quite a bit over the past couple of weeks, where you have these supports that just understand their role a bit better, and they can find these angles that other players and other teams just can't find in some of these fights, and Moham is constantly creating because of that. He was caught out a couple of times as well. I'm not going to say he had a perfect game, but I thought he was generally good. I thought Lucid was the other player here on DK that looked really good for them in the jungle. He is a known playoff performer, at least that's what he's been so far over his very short career, and that has very much continued here. This has been a good series, but the rest of the team, ups and downs. Dud of the game is actually going to go to Aiming in the bot lane. He was really bad in the early game, and that's really where a lot of the problems started to stem. Obviously, the Smolder ended up getting online. They donated quite a few kills in these fights to the Smolder to end up putting him into a good position, and Aiming obviously always been a bit more of a late game player. We always talk about it, but his early game here was actually really detrimental to DK. I think if he was just like surviving, if the Ziggs wasn't able to get nearly as much as he was able to get in the early game, I actually think that this is super winnable. This probably is just like a 30 to 35 minute win for DK, but that wasn't the case. Aiming was set super far behind. It took him quite a while to hit his stack limit, and he really wasn't a champion for long enough to like really make a gigantic difference. I think those positioning mistakes were actually crucial. Not only the level like 3 or whatever, you know, death he had, but also just not being consequential at all and positioning very poorly in a lot of the skirmishes in the mid game as well. So I don't think Aiming played a particularly good game, but at the end of the day, DK probably should have still won this, and the fact that they didn't is fine. They just need to bounce back here in game 4. You certainly don't want to go to a game 5 now with FearX. That's when you would start to worry, but losing one game against a team you're heavily favored against, not really the biggest problem in the world, and so we'll see what happens here in game 4. If FearX can keep the momentum up and really capitalize off the fact that they were lucky to win this game 3, then that's massive for them, but we got to see them do it on the Rift before I believe. They've got to win this game number 4. Can they keep their hopes alive once more? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Dplus KIA, they are going to take game number 4. They're going to close out this series in 4 games with a 3-1 series win, and they will be moving on to round 2, qualifying, of course, for the double elimination stage of the playoffs. Congratulations to them. Obviously, this was expected. Would have been a pretty big upset if they lost this series, but they're able to get the job done. Kind of a 4-0. I mean, really, game 3 was definitely, up in the air. I'm not saying that they obliterated that game or anything, but they probably should have ended up winning it. They just kind of threw it at the end, and they come out here in game 4 and they proved that by dominating this game. This was a 23-minute slaughter. FearX was never even remotely close in this matchup. DK just kind of obliterated them in every single lane across the board. They were able to go for all the risky plays that they wanted. They were so greedy. They didn't even really take this game all that seriously, and they still were able to demolish it. This really shouldn't be happening in the playoffs, but it is what it is. There is a bit of a tier gap in between like the top 5 and everybody else, and unfortunately that means the number 6 team just is a little bit beatable in the playoffs. To FearX's credit, I think over the course of this series, they definitely tried things, and they tried to be a team that ended up competing with DK. They just didn't have the firepower to end up doing so, and that means you get a series like this that is a bit of a stomp. So we'll quickly go over this game 4, but really not a lot to talk about in terms of actual analysis to pull out of this game because it was kind of a destruction. Player of the game can go to anyone, but I'm going to give it to my player of the series, and that is Moham in the support position. 4 straight games of Rel. I think people are definitely going to question that. There's got to be some sort of strategy that is just taking him off of this champion. I'm not saying that he can't play other champions. I'm sure he can. He's a good engaged player. He seems to have a very good eye for just finding those angles, as I talked about before, but at the end of the day, I want to see it. The player that I've most compared Moham to has actually been Lebrov over in the LEC. For those of you who follow my LEC coverage, I'm a big fan of Lebrov. I think he's a very good player, a very good engaged threat, and somebody that you have to be mindful of basically in every single team fight, because individually, he's one of the best team fighters in Europe, and I think Moham plays almost identical to Lebrov. It's very funny how similarly I think that they end up operating in a lot of these key exchanges, and that's really a big positive for DK. If you're able to find those angles and set things up for the rest of the team, everything falls into place, especially when you're drafting things like Yasuo and Rumble and Misfortune for those bullet times to be able to just clean up a lot of fights. If you land that one engage, if Moham is good at all in this game, it's over. Like, there's genuinely no way to outplay that if you're FearX, so long as Moham is one of the better players in the game. I do want to give a shout out to Kingen. He was very narrowly player of the series here for me as well. I thought he played really well across all 4 of these games. This Rumble was so disgusting. When I talk about greed, when I talk about disrespect in terms of the plays that were being made, Kingen kind of encapsulates that in terms of this game. I mean, actively diving a tier 2 tower just to pick up 2 kills in a 2v1 as the Rumble, like, it's maximum disrespect. There's genuinely nothing else you can say about it. It's, one of those games that's just like, okay, yeah, you're so far ahead. Like, it just doesn't matter. So shout out to Kingen on the Rumble. Lucid had a great series. I thought he was probably the most consistent member of DK, never really had a bad moment, even if he was never really the standout for me. Aiming, Showmaker, they all were good, especially with the bullet times this game for aiming. The dodges in the bot lane on that 1v1 against Zeri, very funny, but DK was just better across the board. Again, not a shocking outcome, but it's good to see that the team that was supposed to dominate ended up dominating as anticipated. And then for FearX on the other side, they tried their best. They tried to be competitive in a series like this, but they, again, just don't really have the roster to be able to do that. Dud of the game has to go to someone. I'm going to personally give it to Raptor. I think you could give it to anybody. Henna was really bad. I know his scoreline is probably the only one that looks even remotely okay because he was the only one who got kills on the side of FearX, but man, his mechanics were really bad on the Zeri in this game. I think Duro had some not so good engages. Closer pulls out his signature Akali here in game 4 and goes 0-4-0 on it. So like, whoever you want to give this dud of the game to, I think it's pretty wide open. I thought Raptor was the least consequential player in this game and also probably the worst in the series. I don't give dud of the series. I feel like that's kind of a weird way to kind of talk about a series as a whole, but Raptor just was not up for the challenge here today. Lucid completely gapped him, and I don't think he was good in any of the 4 games, even their win in game number 3. I just didn't feel like he was impactful in any sort of meaningful way. He needs to be better for this team to operate because he was just so important for them. But the problem with Raptor is just that he was bad against players that were better than him. It's very similar to the problem that Willer had when, like, you just destroy a lot of the junglers that you can outpace and outskill in the early game, and then when you can't do that, you're just not really able to compete at all. It's kind of like a more exaggerated version of Milky Way over in the LPL, where it's really just about the matchup rather than about the skill level of Raptor, which is an unfortunate way to look at it, but Not a good series from him. Clear was irrelevant on the Ornn. Like I said, Henna's mechanics this game were horrible. Closer, plays the Akali into Yasuo matchup in a pivotal elimination game number 4 and then gets absolutely obliterated on the Akali. It's not really an ideal set of circumstances, but hopefully FearX can learn and grow from this. Their year is not over. They're just eliminated from playoffs. Again, because they qualified for the summer split playoffs over KDF, they actually qualify for the regional qualifier as well to get to Worlds, and so they will be playing there. Obviously, major long shot for them to make it anywhere out of that either. It's not exactly like they're going to be favorites against anybody there, as they're already not favorites now, but we'll see what ends up happening. FearX is one of those teams that I think could surprise somebody in a game or two, so hopefully they can learn and grow from this and play the rest of the year out a little bit better. But for DK, dominant win. They're moving on to round 2. They don't know their opponent yet. It's all dependent on who ends up winning on the other side of this bracket, and because it's side selection, so Genji gets to choose who they want to play of the 2 winners in today's video. DK, I think, is definitely an option depending on who ends up winning that second series, but they definitely proved that they are no pushover here today. But then moving on to our second of the first round series, and this one was definitely a lot more interesting on paper, not only because these 2 teams are closer, but because it's likely the biggest rivalry we have here in the LCK. It's a telecom war here in the playoffs as we see the number 4 seeded T1 take on the number 5 seeded KT Rolster. Really excited to see these 2 teams go head to head because they're kind of on very interesting trajectories in and of itself. Like, both of them have a lot of things to talk about. Like, both good and bad. It's not necessarily just one team moving up, one team moving down, or both of them moving in one direction. They're both going all over the place, and so it's definitely going to be an interesting kind of series to watch and monitor, but one of these teams is going to be out in round number 1, and I don't think either of them wanted that going into the year. For T1, obviously this is one of the harder teams to evaluate in the LCK because the expectation is just that they're going to figure it out, that they're going to be good, that they're going to be a finals contender, and they're going to be a worlds contender, and all that stuff, because this is a roster that has been to back-to-back world finals. They won it last year. They are the defending world champions at the current moment, and we're sitting here with them as the number 4 seed, and genuinely, if you just took the tape from the summer split, you're questioning whether or not this team is like guaranteed to even make Worlds in the first place, because there are so many questions about how they have been playing. Gumayusi and KT have been holding down the fort as much as possible, especially in the back half of the split down in the bottom lane, but the top side of the map has been majorly questionable, and specifically Faker has been majorly questionable. It really started at MSI. We talked about it a lot at MSI that he just wasn't very good at that tournament, but we were like, oh, the wrist issues are reportedly popping back up, and generally speaking, he probably just needed a rest. Well, turns out he can't get that rest. Not only do they have to come right back and do the LCK, but they have the Esports World Cup in the middle of the year. They have to travel all the way over to Saudi in the middle of the regular season to go and do that. They go to the finals. They win the freaking tournament. They come back. They have to play immediately again in the LCK. Like, there is no rest for Faker, and I genuinely think that it is clear to see that that has affected his gameplay a lot, and I would love to sit here and say that things are just going to get better for him, but it's not like they've had rest before this playoff series. Like, there is no reason to believe that Faker will not just be a little bit of a question mark for this team, because that's kind of what he's been over the last couple of months, really ever since MSI, and the problem with that is that so much of this team relies on the pressure that is generated through the middle of the map, specifically Owner in the jungle, who I think has also played significantly worse in the recent weeks without Faker really popping off. And so, with this team's strategy being centered so much around the GOAT, when he's a little bit out of form, you have to find other ways to win. Now, they have been able to do that against easy-to-beat opposition. Teams are really easy to beat when Gumayusi and KT pop off, if only because they are so talented. I think Gumayusi has really emerged as one of the better carries in the world over the course of this split. KT, I think, has gotten back into form in the last, 2 weeks or so, but Zeus needs to be somebody that really steps up. I think he's integrally important towards this team's success in a series like this, and so we'll see with T1, but for KT on the other side, they are the pinnacle of inconsistency. I mean, they're coming into the playoffs at 500, 9-9, and man, do their results actually speak for that. They've lost to some of the worst teams in the league. They've beaten Gen G. Like, they can do anything. Their highs and their lows are as drastic as it can possibly get. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk, and I mentioned this in the previous video about the record of 500 teams coming into the playoffs and how they have done in the summer split and at Worlds in particular over the last 2 years in the LCK. Last year, it was T1, who went on to win Worlds. 2 years ago, it was DRX who went on to win Worlds. And so, you know, obviously there's like some weird hype surrounding this team in terms of just the narrative. But as you guys know, I've been covering the league both of those years, every single game. And I feel very differently about KT Rolster to how I felt about those two. DRX always had the upside to be able to make it happen. And T1 was T1. They were just going through a fakerless run in the summer split with him taking some rest. This is not the same kind of team as those two. Their inconsistencies are a lot more concerning. I think, in my opinion, the problems are a lot more defined, mostly because, yes, they are inconsistently great, but like the bad parts of their game are way more common, I think, than a lot of the other teams. Like, they are way more feast or famine than a lot of the teams that have been kind of their archetype in the last few years. Pyosik and Beryl obviously are very flippy players just naturally, but Deft has been like the most feast or famine player in the LCK across this whole year. He either completely pops off, or in 2 series against KDF, he gets obliterated by Leaper in 4 straight games. Like, there is no in-between here for Deft, and it's just very fun and interesting to watch because it's kind of the opposite of who he has been as a player. He's kind of been the stable, stabilizing force in the bot lane for every team he's played for, and now he's sitting here being the one that either makes or breaks this team. I like Perfect a lot on the top side, and I think there is a reality where he's better than Zeus in this series, but I don't think that's very likely. I think best case scenario for KT, it's kind of a wash on the top side, and BDD, quite frankly, I'm kind of expecting him to be better than Faker. He has been, especially over the last month or so, but you never really know what happens when it comes playoff time. It's really going to be up to the KTRX players, Deft, Beryl, and Pyosik. If they can step up and play well, KT can win any series, but if they play the way that they have for most of this split, it's probably not going to go well for them. It's really up to those core 3 to determine whether or not this team has a chance. But the only way to know if they're going to show up is to watch them play the game, and that means starting off this series by covering game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was T1. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and you just wanted to see T1 come out and just kind of win a game. Now, I gotta be honest, this wasn't exactly the cleanest game in the entire world from them. There were moments where they ended up trying to throw it, or at least giving opportunities to throw it. They overextend on the top side of the map. KT does a great job taking advantage of it, and all of a sudden, Baron goes over to KT. The gold lead is completely gone from T1. The game is completely even, but T1 does a good job of being able to recover from that. They're able to get a lot of the objectives in the later half of the game, the Dragons, and a lot of those close quarter fights end up becoming a bit of a problem for KT because you have players like Gumayusi on the Neela that are able to get into the backline and cause a ton of havoc, and specifically the Senna plus Olaf combo is basically impossible to stop in this game. Olaf is just running rampant across the entire late game here, just unkillable in a lot of circumstances, and T1's draft ends up panning out for them. But I do think that KT put up a really good fight, and we'll talk about that when we get to them. But player of the game for me pretty obviously has to go to KIA. I genuinely don't think it can go to anybody else. Broadcast gave it to Gumayusi, and I get it, like that Neela fight in the back half of the game where he's able to get like that 4-man ultimate, I thought was obviously great, and that's probably what he got player of the game for, but he really misplayed some of the fights before that actually led into them needing to have some sort of miracle fight in the first place, and so I couldn't really justify giving him player of the game. We'll talk about Owner and Faker in a second, trust me, and Owner less so. I don't really have a huge problem with how Owner played this game, but Zeus is the other player that I think you could consider here for player of the game, in my opinion, because the Olaf was generally unstoppable in the back half. He was just running rampant, as I said. He couldn't be stopped. Like, that's literally the whole point of the champion, but specifically with the Senna, it was unkillable. But to me, the part of that sentence that matters is specifically with the Senna. I thought the Senna was so valuable in this game. KIA was just so far ahead of Beryl throughout the entirety of this. Beryl was so far behind, and there really wasn't anything that he could do in the early parts of the game, and because they had the Senna, they could play a lot more aggressive, and they could take a lot of these fights and win a lot of these fights that they otherwise wouldn't be able to win, in my opinion. So I think a lot of the credit does have to go to KIA individually as a player. I think he's been significantly better as of late. He got player of the week in week 9, the final week of the LCK regular season. It seems that form has carried over quite a bit into the start of this series, but it's not all sunshine and rainbows for T1, because dud of the game is actually going to stay on their side. It's going to go to Faker, and I talked about it, man. Like, this guy is just not in form right now. People are going to point to that first Azira engage in the mid lane where they were able to get BDD, but outside of that, like, Faker didn't do anything in this game. Like, everybody on KT, I think, was trying to win. There was a lot of good moments from them, but Faker was mispositioned, over-aggressive in a lot of instances, and I think, for me, the concerning thing is not that his mechanics are bad, because honestly, it's really not a mechanical problem on tape. Like, you would think that with a wrist problem or you know, burnout was the issue, that it would be him just not being quite as quick in terms of his reactions and not being able to go toe-to-toe with players like BDD in terms of that regard, but that's not really been the problem. He's been just as good mechanically as he typically is. He's just been so greedy and so over-aggressive, and oftentimes it just gets him into trouble. He's often looking for kills and trying to stick in situations that just don't have positive outcomes for him. He's taking a lot more 50-50s than he normally would. His trades aren't as good in laning phase. It's just a lot of these minor things that you would think would be fine for Faker. Like, of all players, of all the problems that he could individually have, I wouldn't think that taking bad trades and making bad decisions in terms of when to step up would be the problem, but it's kind of been an issue for him over the course of the last few months. And so, again, you go and watch this game, and there's multiple times where he's just out of position. Now, a lot of times it doesn't matter because KIA is there, and he's able to kind of salvage a lot of positions in general, and, you know, KT in the back half of the game just have to spend all of their time trying to care about Olaf and Nila, and so there's not a lot of room to take advantage of Faker's mispositioning, but, like, you go and watch these fights, he's in a bad spot, either because he's too far forward, or because he's not doing any damage, and you just wonder why. Like, you wonder what's going on here, and so I just want to see more out of Faker. Like, I know the expectations are crazy high, and obviously there's been a lot of talk about his mental because of some of the things that have been shown on stage, but like, I'm not just going to sit here and say that he's not playing way below expectation, because he is at the current moment, but it wasn't enough to drag the team down. Everybody else was good. Owner was fine, by the way. The scoreline is whatever, but Owner was fine on the Lilia. I really have no issue with his gameplay, but for KT on the other side, they definitely tried. Getting that comeback fight on the top side to get that Baron was absolutely massive, and it shows the resilience that this team has. I think that there are players on this team that are playing really well. BDD is just in such good form, and he was definitely the better mid laner in this game between these two. You know, the Smolder had the opportunity to potentially try to win this game. They just didn't really have the ability to peel off the Olaf and the Senna in the late game, and that was really the end of it. There's no way to keep your Smolder MF like Wombo combo alive. You want to hit that Seraphine ult into bullet time and then just kind of clean up with Smolder damage, and it's just never going to happen if Olaf goes completely immune to it. So, you know, it just is what it is. It's kind of a bit of a counter pick, but I thought everybody on the team played relatively fine. If I was going to give a dud of the game to somebody on the side of KT, it probably would have been Beryl, but that's only because he was down so much in the early game. I think he was actually making some pretty good plays towards the back half, and so I really didn't want to give that to him. I don't think he earned it, but he was the player that I thought was probably the most detrimental in terms of gold acquisition and resource acquisition for KT, but overall, I don't think this is the worst game one in the world. You just need to build upon the things that you did right in the back half of the game. If you can actually survive in the early game, that could be a really good sign for KT, but you really do need to tie this up. You don't want to have to win 3 games in a row against T1. That's basically an impossible ask, and so big game number 2 for both of these teams. Which one's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was KT Rolster. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up the series at 1 apiece, and this was a really good game from them. With them trying to make that comeback in game number 1, obviously not being able to make it happen, you wanted to see them come out and, you know, keep that fire, keep that energy, and you know what? They absolutely did just that. A very weird draft for T1. They're known to do this. They're known to have these crazy weird picks. Obviously, more than just the Lee Sin in the support position, KIA is always going to pull out something insane at least once a year. It's just kind of how things operate with him, but even something like the Yasuo in the mid lane is not something that I would have expected them to go to in game number 2 of this series, but yet here we are, and KT was able to take advantage of kind of these weird picks. They very much did not work out for T1 on the other side here. I really like their draft. I think it gives them quite a few options, and generally speaking, we're seeing the trend go long in the LCK. We're seeing the games go a lot longer, and we're not seeing like these early game advantages be taken advantage of nearly as much as they are in other regions, and so drafting Sedge, Ziggs, Smolder, like, yeah, I think it's a pretty good idea to, I'm basically, the longer this game goes, the stronger KT Rolster ends up getting, and they took advantage of that. Not that they needed forever, they only needed 29 minutes, but still a really good game from them. Player of the game, very easy, gonna go to BDD. I'm going to be honest, it's been a bit of a mid-gap through the first 2 games. I know maybe I'm a bit harder on it than most will be, but I think the Smolder was obviously gigantic in the team fights in this game, and generally speaking, the Yasuo wasn't particularly good in the laning phase either, and so you're really looking at a situation where the Smolder was allowed to do basically whatever he wanted, and BDD took full advantage of that. The consistency with which he has been playing over the last couple of weeks is entirely admirable because he was so rocky through the first part of the year. Honestly, now that I look back at it in like a big retrospective, his year this year is not all that dissimilar to like Showmaker's last year in the way that I was talking about him, where he would be really up and down for certain stretches, but like you would have those 2, 3, 4 week stretches in the middle of the year where he would like be the best player in the world. That's kind of what Showmaker was in 2023. You just weren't getting it all that consistently. I think BDD fits a very similar mold right now. He's just currently going through one of those stretches where he's one of the best players in the world in terms of the output that he's putting out. He could actively just straight up win KT Rolster this series if he is going to continue to play the way that he is right now. I want to give a big shout out to Beryl. I thought he was excellent in this game on the rel. So many engages, so many free setups that just made this game so much easier for KT. I honestly think he's going under the radar for just how important he was. Pioshik was amazing on this Edge-1. It feels like a lot of the players that are super inconsistent that we talked about needing to step up, kind of determining whether or not KT could win or lose this series. It feels like all of them are playing well at the current moment. And, Perfect. Even Perfect had some fantastic performances. We're not going to talk too much about the early laning phase, but that gank on the top side with, Pioshik's help, perfectly timed. Like literally about as perfect of a mechanical play as you could possibly make coming out on the top side of the map. It just looked really good for KT Rolster. They need to be able to repeat this, but honestly, from what we've seen so far, there's no real reason to believe that they cannot do that. And for T1, you want to stay optimistic about this team, and I think that there is a lot of reasons to stay optimistic and say that this is a bit more of an outlier because your draft is just so wild. Like the Senna, obviously something that you have a lot of experience playing and that you feel very comfortable bringing out, but something like Lee Sin support, Yasuo in the mid lane, these aren't things that I would expect T1 to particularly succeed on, and so them not succeeding on it I don't think is the end of the world, but I do need to see this team clean up some of their decision making. Again, dud of the game is going to go to Faker in the mid lane. This Yasuo just did nothing. You can talk about the fact that early on in the game he was attempting to try to clean up some plays, but by the time we hit the late game, he was going in first. He was trying to do damage, doing no damage because he was getting CC'd and then just immediately dying to the Smolder. The Yasuo just wasn't able to really accomplish anything. I continue to really question his decision making in terms of when to engage and when to play safe and, kind of when to balance that act. He obviously stepped up in the mid lane and just died for no reason in the middle of this game. There's just weird stuff happening with Faker that I can't particularly explain right now, and maybe there are going to be people in the comments that say I'm being way too harsh on him, that say that I don't know ball because I'm clearly not seeing what Faker's intending to do and it's actually the team not following up. I just don't see it. There are a lot of times where I agree with stuff like that. I've talked about it a lot specifically in Western regions when a lot of these mid laners in particular get bad raps for essentially being the only players to try and do anything. That's not what's happening here with Faker. He just seems to be entirely disconnected from the rest of the team, which is very strange. I continue to want to see more out of the rest of this team as well. I mean, KT was actively walking into Ziggs bombs by the end of this game. He just was not on point in terms of his mechanics. Guma was fine. The Senna is crazy strong, and I see why they want to prioritize it, but maybe not with the Lee Sin. It didn't really seem to work. Owner's just kind of been there. Pioshik's been better. Zeus has kind of been there. Perfect has been better. KT through the first 2 games, I think has looked like the better team. That's not to say that they have full control. It's just tied up at 1 apiece, and that means game 3 becomes so integral, so important. You guys know I think game 3 is the most important when you are tied at 1 apiece. Having to win both of the final 2 games is a much tougher ask than only having to win one of the final 2. But, KT going in with quite a bit of momentum. Can T1 swing that back around in their favor, or is KT going to express some dominance here in game number 3? Well, the winner of game number 3 was T1. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go back up in this series 2-1, and this was the game I was looking for from T1. I get it still was a bit sloppy in the mid game. They still gave way too much gold over to the Smolder by just making small positioning mistakes. Owner gets caught, and then Faker gets caught, and then Smolder gets a tower, and all of a sudden this game has become a lot more difficult, yada, yada, yada. But outside of that, 3-minute stretch in the middle of the game, they were pretty clean. Now, that 3-minute stretch is definitely still concerning, but I would much rather this game 3 than either game 1 or game 2. This, in my opinion, was T1's best game of the series by far. I just want to see them clean up some of the mid-game mistakes that it feels like they're pretty constantly making, but honestly, at this point, it's more of a, I just want to see them be able to clean that up because I think they can really compete near the top of the standings rather than I think they need to clean that up in order to beat a team like KT Rolster. This is the kind of game you can play against a KT and beat them, every time, and that's just what I want to see here in round number 1. I want to see a team that definitely deserves to be moving on to the second round without feeling like, oh, they're actually in trouble, and they weren't in trouble really at all here in game number 3. Player of the game is going to go to Owner for me. This was kind of a more complete performance than I think we had been getting from him in the first couple of games on the Lilia. You know, the champion's really strong. I think it does so many different things. Pioshik's been pretty good on the Sejuani on the other side of this matchup for most of this series, and so you feel good about Owner stepping up and actually being able to use his early game advantage in this one. But I think the stabilizing force, as we talk about so much, is that Faker honestly had a pretty good game. Again, he gets caught out randomly in the mid game, and that's just kind of is something that you have to accept with Faker right now. Is just that's what's happening. He's going to give over some gold for basically no reason in the middle of the game. But outside of those weird plays, he was very valuable. He was very, very valuable in this one. And again, these two people are just so connected. They are so interconnected in terms of their performances. When Faker is alive and playing well and like actually doing stuff in the mid game, then Owner is actually really active as well. The early game was a lot better here from the middle of the map, and I think that that was a very important factor. Zeus continuing to play things like the Olaf as well, I think is definitely helping out this team in terms of their consistency, because KT don't have an answer. They genuinely have no way to get, you know, Olaf off of their backline carries. If he pops the ult and just runs onto the Smolder, there is genuinely nothing that KT can do to stop him, and it really does feel like Olaf has become a bit of a power pick in this series, all things considered. Perfect is obviously not playing perfect League of Legends, as his name wouldn't imply, but Zeus is definitely capitalizing on whatever advantages he is able to get, and honestly, he's been majorly important across all three of these games so far, but specifically their wins in games 1 and 2. So some positives, some negatives. I do want to see this team continue to stay consistent. Again, I want to see them clean up these weird mistakes in the mid game. I want them to go through an entire game and just have a lead, be able to slowly play it out, win one fight, and end the game. I want the T1 special. I want that back. Right now, it feels like we are just kind of caught in the middle of that, where they're still able to get the leads and they're still able to close out the games, but everything in the middle is a little bit up in the air. Once they figure out all three, like, again, my expectation goes through the roof. That's what I want to see to really believe they can make the finals and like genuinely be a top 2 team here in the LCK. And then for KT Rolster on the other side, you tried your best in the mid game. You got the gold onto the Smolder, which you needed to do. BDD continues to be the singular win condition for KT in this series. It just unfortunately wasn't enough. No matter the amount of gold that you have on the Smolder, you can't just keep the Olaf off the Smolder. And there was a really good engage by KIA down the stretch as well on the Rel that actually just landed onto the Smolder, and then one fight, poof, the game is over. Like that, in that case, it was a T1 special, but, you know, BDD did a good job in the mid game of trying to stay alive, trying to keep it open, and trying to keep his options available for him and for the rest of the team. And again, BDD is just kind of the lifeblood, but everybody else in this team could have stepped up. I think Pioshik was much more passive in this game 3, and that's really not something that I think KT thrives off of. I think they really want to be one of those teams that's just like always on the gas, constantly pushing the tempo. And then you've got, you know, Deft and Barrel, who, like, Guma and KIA didn't really do a ton in the early game, but neither did Deft and Barrel, and you really need to be the one that is actively kind of doing stuff on the misfortune. That is your role, that is your job on that champion. And so again, you just want to see maybe more go button opportunities, but the mid game was fine. Unfortunately, dud of the game is going to go to Perfect in the top lane. As I stated, not really a great game from him. He certainly had his own problems, but Zeus continues to be such a menace in the back half of these games that Perfect has to be able to match that in some way, shape, or form, and I just didn't feel like the Renekton was relevant. I don't think he individually played horrible. Like, this isn't one of those games where he threw things for KT. He just wasn't nearly as relevant as anybody else in the game, and in a game like this, going 0-3, it's just not good enough. You don't want to be the one that is giving gold to the other side of the matchup, and so, you know, for KT, you're now down 1-2. You gotta win this game number 3, or game number 4, I should say, or else your series, your playoffs are over. You would still be alive in the regional qualifier, but you don't want to lose in round number 1. KT's expectations are obviously a lot higher than that, but T1 definitely want to close out this series as quickly as possible. They want to gain as much momentum and confidence as they can get going into that second round and, you know, playing against one of those top 2 teams. And so we'll see what happens here in game number 4, but we could be seeing the end of our second series. Is that going to happen? Well, the winner of game number 4 was T1. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to close out this series 3-1, and they will be moving on to round number 2. Very excited for them. Obviously, we want to see this team get into form. League is more fun when T1 is really good, and so them closing out this series with 2 of the strongest games that they played in a while, I think is really good. Not that they were bad in the back half of the regular season. I think there just were question marks about them because of their series against big teams, but against KT Rolster, you wanted to see them come out out and just be better. And at least in game 3, game 4, they definitely were. They definitely came out and kind of dominated them here. KT had some moments here, but at the end of the day, T1 actually really controlled this game 4. It doesn't necessarily reflect as much in the stats. I know the gold looks pretty similar, the kills look pretty similar, but this was pretty much always in T1's hands. In fact, I would consider this a pretty classic T1 type of game where it's just really slow, not a lot is happening, you know, T1 getting a lot of advantages everywhere on the map, just being up about 2k gold basically the entire game, and then eventually KT oversteps once, loses a fight, and ends up losing the game off of it. It's really like vintage for T1, if you will, in terms of how they performed, and that is a very good sign. The draft, also relatively vintage T1, the Caitlyn Lux in the bot lane, that's something they really like to go towards in these big situations. You probably knew it was over the moment you saw Gumayusi Caitlyn, but also even kind of the Vayne in the top lane. We're going to talk about it here. Player of the game and player of the series as a whole is going to go to Zeus in the top lane for me. Just felt like he was a massive part of why T1 was able to get the advantages they were able to get. Obviously, the Vayne was amazing here in game number 4. The damage he was able to do was by far the most impactful in the game, but I really don't want to undersell the rest of this series. Obviously, the 2 games of Olaf are big. He gets that pentakill in game number 1. He's a big disruptor to be able to take down the Smolder in game number 3. And then you have this big pop-off performance on Vayne. I think Zeus is just so important towards what T1 does that it's so encouraging when you see him come out for a series like this and just be really strong. Be able to go into Perfect, who honestly played fine. I don't think Perfect was the problem at all in this series, especially in this game. He definitely was the one attempting to do some things in the back half of the game with teleports and flanks and things like that on the Renekton, but Zeus was still so relevant because he was just getting so much gold, and he was really good at doing stuff with it. It wasn't just like, oh, he's Vayne and he's able to get this gigantic lead in the top lane. It's in the late game, he's actively diving in and trying to do as much damage as possible with the rest of his team, understanding that they just have to, you know, clear space, clear time for the Vayne to be able to win. So really nice to see the team play around him in a good way. Again, Guma and KT were really good in this game. You know, Lux is very difficult to end up dealing with unless you have a boatload of damage, and the Corki just unfortunately wasn't fed enough, although BDD definitely tried, and we'll talk about him in a second. You know, Guma's untouchable on Caitlyn. He's just so freaking good at this champion. It's actually absurd. You know, Faker and Owner were fine. Owner had a couple of good plays. Faker continues to just kind of be there. Again, I just want to see more out of him. He's been the weakest player on this team for a section of this year. I'm not going to say for the whole year, obviously. He was really good in spring, but ever since MSI, there have been those lingering questions. I don't think he was perfect in this series at all. I think 3 of the 4 games were pretty questionable from him, but at the end of the day, you get the win, and if the team's able to play in a good way without him, that's even more encouraging because you have to imagine he's going to get in form eventually. But Owner was solid here. Just overall, it's nice to see T1 winning. They, of course, move on to round 2. We will talk about who their matchup is in just a minute because I think it's obviously still up for debate. We'll talk about it when we go over the bracket. But for KT, on the other side, this is not one of those losses that you should be walking out being like, wow, were we bad the whole time? I think you put up a really good fight, not only in this game, but in this series overall. None of these games were free wins for T1. You definitely made them work for it. And honestly, like if we're just talking about raw individual performances, like BDD was the best player in this series. Like genuinely, if you look at all 4 games, I think BDD was the player that stood out the most to me from both teams in this series. I just can't reasonably give player of the series to somebody who lost 3-1. It doesn't feel particularly good, but I mean, like if he had a better team around him in this one, I actually think this becomes a lot more intriguing because he was phenomenal. And if BDD keeps this form up, this team might actually have a pretty easy case to be made that they are a Worlds team. Now, that's not easy here in the LCK. There's only 4 spots, and there are 5 teams that are definitely going to be fighting for that role, but BDD is certainly going to make it more interesting if he's going to play as good as he did here today. Deft and Barrel were also fine. Ezreal Karma as the answer to Caitlyn Lux I think is generally fine. Both are, you know, aggressive poke lanes. I talked about it a bit earlier. I think those are kind of underrated at the moment. Things like Kalista Renata, Ezreal Karma, Caitlyn Lux, I think they're a lot stronger than people are giving them credit for because supports don't want to play enchanters, they want to play engagers, and I understand that, but, you know, I still think that they're very valuable to have, especially for the early game pressure. Pioshik was pretty good here. Like I said, Perfect had a couple of good engages. I do have to give a dud of the game, and it is going to go to Barrel just because the Karma didn't really do anything, but again, it wasn't the biggest problem in the entire world. I just wanted to see a slight bit more out of the Karma, but overall, it's really hard to feel bad about KT. Again, yes, they're eliminated from the playoffs, but their year is not over. They're going into the regional qualifier, and this was kind of expected. T1 is a really rough draw in round number 1 because this team always levels up, and having to face them in a one-off series where one of you is going to be out of the playoffs, it's just not a real ideal situation situation for KT. They're still going to have to fight an uphill battle because they are going into the regional qualifier as the number 5 seed. It means they have to win 2 series instead of 1 to qualify for Worlds, but if any team can pull that off, especially with the 9-9 like weird like anti-curse going on, it might actually be KT Rolster. But great win for T1. Really big confidence booster here for me. It's going to be about what they do from here, obviously, that defines how important of a victory this actually was in the end, but at the very least they've set themselves up, I think, in a pretty good manner. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCK round number 1 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, of course, the updated bracket after the first round. We know our second round matchups. We have our selections locked in. Of course, DK and T1 moving on from winning today, as we've already gone over, to meet Gen G and Hanwha Life, but because Gen G has top seed, they get their pick of which team they would rather face in round number 2, and they have chosen Dplus KIA. This is not really a surprise. This is what I predicted in my bracket prediction, just because it feels like it makes more sense. T1's cap is much higher than Dplus KIA's. If I'm Gen G, I'm making the exact same decision that they are making here. This is probably the right move for them, although we'll talk about why I think this does create the 2 more interesting matchups for both of these teams right now, shall we? Let's preview what I'm expecting here in round 2. First, Gen G taking on Dplus KIA. You know, Gen G are obviously going to be big favorites coming into this because they're big favorites in any series that they play. If they lose a series, that's already going to be such a massive upset with how dominant they've been in the LCK. But the reason this is interesting, of course, Canyon versus Showmaker, always a fun playoff series. Lucid versus Canyon, that's honestly been one of Lucid's best matchups historically, and so there are reasons to believe that DK actually has a little bit of like an edge on Gen G that they don't normally have on other, you know, teams, that Gen G doesn't have against other teams, that there might actually be some concerns there. But at the end of the day, it's not real. Like, Gen G's the better team. They've been able to beat them every time this year, even with Lucid playing really well in Canyon, not exactly being perfect into them. And then you've got T1 taking on Hanwha Life. This is definitely the one that a lot of people are looking towards, and this is really the series that's going to shape my perception of probably the rest of the playoffs here, because if T1 is able to come out and win this series and actually like be better than HLE, then yeah, I'm all in on them being a top 2 team in the LCK. I am predicting them to go to the finals and yada yada yada, right? But if HLE come out and win this, then you know that really cements what we've seen so far in the summer split. Don't forget, these teams have played quite a bit this year already, and there's a reason I'm going to consider Hanwha Life to be the favorites in this series, and that's because HLE has actually gotten the better of T1 for most of this year. They have played what? They played 4 best of 3s and 2 best of 5s. They've split 1-1 on the best of 5s in the playoffs last split, and over their regular season matchups, it's 3-1 in favor of HLE in terms of those best of 3s, and so it's certainly not a series that T1 has dominated over the course of this year. I imagine Hanwha Life are going to be going in as favorites, but again, this series is going to tell us a lot about who is legit moving forward. Maybe T1 can power up in the lower bracket, but I am predicting Hanwha Life. Let me know if you agree or disagree with that down below, but I do quickly want to touch upon the regional finals as well. Up on the screen, kind of this convoluted setup, because it's a bit of a convoluted situation because Gen G has already qualified via winning MSI and making playoffs, giving them an automatic spot. It does get a little bit complicated depending on whether or not Gen G actually make finals and like qualify via the playoffs, if you will, if they are either the champions of the league or if they have the most championship points outside of the champion, then obviously they'll go as the 1 or the 2 seed. But if somehow, some way that doesn't happen, let's say they lose to DK and then they lose to, you know, T1 or Hanwha Life in the lower bracket, which is obviously very unlikely, but let's say it happens, then they're slotted into the left side of this bracket where KT and FearX, who obviously lost in round number 1, play in round 1. You've got 2 other teams there, and the winner goes on to face Gen G. Both of them qualify for Worlds, but Gen G could potentially go as the 4th seed if they were to theoretically lose everything. Now, if Gen G do qualify through playoffs either by winning the LCK or alternatively by going as the number 2 seed, either making finals or just having more championship points than whoever loses in finals, then we will get our standard bracket on the right side with KT and FearX, and then the other 2 teams that would be in the regional qualifiers. This is obviously a very weird setup that is only really existing because Gen G is already qualified for Worlds, but it was worth at least going over in the video, so I hope that makes at least a little bit of sense. Likely we will not have to worry about the left side of this because it would be a pretty big shock if Gen G doesn't at least make finals. I think that would certainly surprise quite a few people, but it was certainly worth at least throwing out there. But that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LCK, although we will be posting about every single series the rest of the year. Of course, for the LCK, we post about all 4 of the major regions as well. So LCS, LEC, LPL. We also cover the NACL Tier 2 over in North America. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL esports, especially with Worlds right around the corner, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.